July 24, 1943. Off the Marianas, a steel tube rides the cold layer lungs, tight nerves tied to the TDC. Fire. The Mark 14 surges, the boat shudders, men count. A square hit, then nothing. No plume, no flame, only a dull kiss on enemy steel. Another shot. Another thud. Escorts turn. Bulbs tremble. Frames groan. When the boat slips away, the skipper voices the unapproved fix. If Washington can't repair our torpedo, we will at sea under fire tonight. Kill the magnetic, stiffen the contact, prove it on real steel, or keep hunting with a weapon that refuses to kill. In Tokyo, Sasebo and Truk departure briefings repeat a soothing axiom: American submarines are harassment, not a hinge. Merchants run their schedules zigzag by manual. Escorts hold formation. Hydrophones sweep. Oil reaches furnaces, rice reaches depots. The core belief is sealed. Problem X, a stealth threat close enough to choke an empire's arteries, is unsolvable. The Pacific is too wide, the U.S. force too thin, and their torpedoes, by rumor and report, strike without exploding. From naval classrooms to pierside wardrooms, officers are fed comforting curves, detection rates, depth charge patterns, tables of attacks disrupted. Discipline is armor. Speed, spacing, and rote procedure are destiny. Isolated reports of audacious American approaches are filed behind familiar math. A handful of faulty torpedoes cannot break continental logistics at sea. Most of all, they laugh at the notion that the enemy would defy doctrine, tear open exploders, and refit weapons in the middle of a campaign. A practice manuals deem reckless, even impossible. So convoys sail with confidence, convinced that physics and bureaucracy will protect them. If the Americans fire, many shots will run deep. Others will detonate early, and those that do hit will die on impact. That is the status quo until the sea begins returning different answers. The Axis laughed because the numbers on paper told them to. American doctrine, as taught and telegraphed before the war, trusted the laboratory a magnetic exploder that would break a ship's back without touching it. A contact pistol so sensitive a glancing hit would suffice. A depth system so exact it could write signatures beneath a keel. Axis analysts read the published boasts and perversely took comfort from them. Complex mechanisms multiply failure paths. If the Americans had built a watch instead of a hammer, war sea physics would shake it apart. Then came the patrol reports that seemed to prove the jeer. Sub after sub returned with stories that sounded like alibis, solid hits that yielded only a thud. Perfect angles producing premature bursts 100 yards shy. Scope observations of tracks sliding serenely under bellies that should have been torn open. In staff rooms from Yokosuka to Rabaul, these accounts were plotted against convoy losses that remained irritating rather than existential. The conclusion hardened: the United States had over-engineered its fish. They had trusted theory over tide declination tables, over the ocean's profanity. And because the ocean is the only peer reviewer that matters, the ocean gave its verdict in mockery again and again and again. Problem X looked self-inflicted. Axis officers could point to 3 seams and call them comedy. First depth, the Mark 14 ran deep not by inches but by invisible fathoms. The buoyant belly of a freighter lived in one stratum. The torpedo, obedient to a hydrostat, calibrated in tank water and wishful thinking, hunted in another. A weapon that prides itself on passing under a keel becomes a ghost if it dives too devoutly. Second, magnetics. The Mark 6 exploder was tuned for ideal textbooks, not a Pacific, whose magnetic moods are local, lopsided, and layered. A torpedo detonating early, crowned in an empty sea, was a gift to any convoy commander. Third, the contact pistol, a firing pin that recoiled from its duty when high closing speeds or oblique strikes bent the frame, shocked the seer, or simply tripped inertia the wrong way. At slow textbook test speeds, the mechanism behaved. At war's pace, metal lied. Axis technical bureaus reading captured pamphlets and listening to intercepted grumbling wrote their own footnotes in the margin doctrinal rigidity. American procurement had declared the torpedo solved and thus cordoned it off from sacrilege. Exploders were not to be desecrated with field hands. Depth systems were not to be doubted by petty officers with feeler gauges. If a weapon failed, the remedy would come by memorandum, not by wrench. That distance Washington from War Tank Pond from Typhoon felt like protection to the Axis. Even if a few U.S. skippers sensed the truth, they would be caged by procedure, and so the laughter grew technical. Japanese escorts trained to hold formation to stack depth charges in mathematical curtains to assume the next attack would be blunted by the same gremlins that spared them yesterday. Merchant masters resumed schedules believing the Americans brought knives that folded. In lectures and late-night wardrooms, senior officers reassured juniors with truisms: complexity breeds brittleness. Doctrine breeds delay. Bureaucracy breeds mercy. Let the enemy field a miracle pistol that cannot decide when to fire. Let them measure depth with instruments that worship paper. The ocean will keep our secret. What they missed, what the laughter masked, was the human hinge. American submariners were not going to litigate survival through channels. They were machinists and farmers' sons and bridge builders in peacoats. If the Bureau locked the toolbox, they would pick it. But in mid-1942, the Axis could not see that. They saw only the comfort of Tren's dud rates that clipped the enemy's claws, quiet wakes beneath keels, the clean survivable geometry of a near miss. They saw a watch still ticking in calm water, and never imagined a fist would come through the glass. Pearl Harbor and Fremantle. Date January to August 1943. The charts on the wall show arteries. Sumatran oil to Japan rice from Indochina bauxite and rubber threading north. Every submarine departure stamps a promise across those lines: sever here, starve there. But the promise keeps slipping. In the patrol debriefs, tonnage claimed dissolves under post-analysis. Probable sinkings are demoted. Damaged becomes the war's most common euphemism for mercy the crew never meant to give. The campaign's math, so elegant in the briefing, devolves into an ugly denominator: torpedoes that arrive and do not decide. Problem X is not an inconvenience. It is existential. A submarine's only reason to exist is the violence sealed in its bow. A diesel-electric boat cannot trade broadsides, cannot linger to try again at musket range. It lives for moments measured in periscope sweeps and bearing rates, and those moments must end in explosions. Take away the blast, and you have sent men to stalk convoys with empty hands. The enemy sees them, learns, and grows bolder. Convoy commanders cut fewer corners. Escorts sweep wider. The Pacific, already wide as a continent, widens another mile inside every sailor's chest. Operationally, the symptoms metastasize. Skippers change approach to flatter angles, seeking square blows, then watch contact pistols crumple from their own speed. Others set shallower depths to force hull strikes, then discover the weapon still swims too deep, caressing geometry rather than steel. Shots fired in perfect spread patterns, beautiful on the TDC's dials, become polite knocks that the ocean swallows. Prematures detonate ahead of the target, a white geyser announcing ambush and inviting vengeance. Suddenly, depth charges feel smarter, ping sweeps feel nearer, and every safe water layer becomes a lie. Boats burn fuel and nerve and return with narratives rather than sinkings. Strategically, the clock is against them. The submarine arm is small, 2% of the Navy's headcount, and tasked with outsized purpose: strangle a maritime empire that cannot live without its tankers. Every month that dude rates remain high is a month the enemy factories stay warm and the air wings keep flying. Allies on distant fronts. Guadalcanal, slogging through jungle bombers clawing at Rabaul, are counting on mathematics beneath the sea. If mathematics cannot be trusted, something else must be. Morally, the burden is corrosive. Torpedomen measure and remeasure. Officers write reports that feel like indictments of themselves. To admit the weapon is broken is to admit patrols risked lives on faith poorly placed. To stay silent is to condemn the next crew to the same hollow thud. In wardrooms, men argue doctrine with the same heat they bring to target angles. In torpedo rooms, chiefs run fingers over exploder housings like doctors hunting a heartbeat. At Pearl, at Fremantle, the problem acquires a face: skippers who take photographs of dented noses, chiefs who smuggle springs in pockets, an admiral who reads too many apologies and refuses one more. The campaign is not merely against Japan. It is against latency, the time it takes a distant office to believe what the sea has already proved. January turns to March and then to July, and the ships that should have died are still writing wakes across maps. So the definition of survival changes. The mission brief still says interdict tonnage sink tankers break the spine of supply. But beneath those lines in ink, only the crews can read. The first objective becomes make the weapon honest. Choose the proving grounds, not in laboratories, but along volcanic coasts where cliffs can serve as judges. Disable the magnetic. Strengthen the contact. Verify depth against rock, not rumor. The place remains Pearl and Fremantle. The date is still 1943, yet the battlefield quietly decisively shifts inside the torpedo itself. Until that battle is won, every interception is a prayer, and every prayer risks going unanswered. He arrived without fanfare, a lean admiral with the sea still in his gait, and a voice that wasted no syllables. He had read too many patrol reports that bled at the margins. He had underlined too many phrases solid hit, no detonation. Premature ran deep to mistake coincidence for physics. In his briefcase, he carried two things: the authority to say enough and a willingness to make enemies on land so his boats could make enemies in the water. Call him the Pacific Submarine Admiral if you like. The crews called him something simpler, the first senior officer who sounded like the ocean. He summoned skippers to Pearl and Fremantle not for ceremony but confession. Behind closed doors, the masks dropped. A commander described a tanker that should have died twice. A chief torpedo man set a dented exploder housing on the table like a skull. A junior officer unfolded a hand-drawn sketch of a firing pin that jumped its own rails at high obliquity. The admiral listened, pencil resting, not moving, not judging, then asked the only question that mattered. What can we do right now? The answer, whispered for months in messes and torpedo rooms, finally stood up and spoke. Turn off the magnetics everywhere now. Stop trusting a compass needle to choose the moment of death. Rebuild the contact pistol until a glancing blow is a killing blow. Test depth against rock and tide, not tank and table. Do it outside the chain of disbelief. Do it where the sea can rule without a clerk. He signed the orders others were afraid to draft. But paper wasn't enough. He needed a proving ground that would answer without politics. Hawaii had an island of rock, Kahulawe, whose cliffs could adjudicate truth. Australia had shoal waters and empty reaches where a torpedo could be fired at a real coastline and told to report back in white water, not in memos. The admiral collected the heretics' machinists' mates who thought like metallurgists, skippers with the gambler's eye and the engineer's patience, flotilla repair officers who could make a spring sing. There was resistance, of course, the kind that wears good shoes and speaks fluent procedure. The Bureau sent cautions wrapped as courtesy. Further evaluation advisable. Do not compromise influence capability. Factory tolerances must be respected. The admiral thanked them and kept going. He did not advertise the schedule. Boats slid out at dusk with practice heads and live warheads in their racks, and the word in the torpedo rooms was simple. We're going to see what's true. At the range, the mood felt treasonous in the best sense. Chiefs laid out contact pistols on canvas tarps like surgeons lining up instruments. They measured filed, stoned edges. They swapped springs for stiffer stock, added shims to keep the firing pin in honest alignment, and peened nose plates to survive the shock of a 90-degree hit at war speed. Electricians pulled the magnetics apart and held the little coils up to the light, as if weighing doctrine itself. Then cut the lead and taped the ends clean. Reversible, undeniable. Skippers rehearsed the geometry. No more wishful underkeel miracles. Depths were set shallower to ensure hull contact. Approach angles were chosen for reality, not for the vanity of textbook prints, close, cold, square, when possible, spread patterns that stitched inevitability. They logged every change like scientists, because they were scientists with grease under their nails. Then they fired at the island. The first detonations felt like a verdict. A torpedo found the cliff and stood the sea on its head. The white plume rose folded and fell as spray. Men who had spent months swallowing disappointment allowed themselves to shout just once. The second shot, same settings, another clean, decisive blast. The third, at an oblique angle that used to be a death sentence for the firing pin's alignment boom, full war voice. Someone laughed like a man who had been holding his breath since the war began. The admiral took the data like a priest receiving confession and transmuted it into doctrine. Magnetic influence disabled fleet-wide. Contact pistol field modification authorized and required. Depth calibration verify against known shoals and cliffs. Accept tank numbers no more. The cable traffic was plain to the point of rudeness. Where opposition persisted, he named names and owned the risk. If there was to be a court-martial, it could have him. But there would be no court-martial. There would be patrols. Boats receded over the horizon with weapons that for the first time in too long matched the courage of their crews. In torpedo rooms, the heresy became ritual gauge, shim, spring, strike test log. In wardrooms, the tone shifted from despair to anticipation, the electric, fearful appetite of hunters who finally trust the teeth in their mouths. Word moved like weather across the theater. Fremantle heard it. Brisbane heard it. Dutch Harbor heard it. The Admiral's impossible idea, fix it in the field, prove it against rock, trust simplicity over seduction, was no longer an idea. It was a method. And like all sound methods in war, it would be judged by explosions. The genius was not mystical. It was a chain of small, stubborn corrections that turned a watch back into a hammer. Start with depth. A torpedo's depth is not a wish, it's a feedback loop. The sea squeezes, the hydrostat feels, the valve admits or denies, the elevators respond. In tank tests, that loop sang in tune. In the Pacific, cold layers and speed-induced pressure fooled the instrument. The weapon swam a man's height or two below the promise. The fix was heretical in its plainness: stop arguing with charts and measure the ocean with the ocean. Load a practice head fitted with a depth verification plug and run it past a shoal of known draft. Run it past a line of marker buoys rigged at fixed depths. Fire at a cliff and read the strike point. Calibrate the hydrostat by reality, then lock it in. When possible, set shallower still, because a glancing kiss on steel with a good contact pistol kills more ships than a perfect underkeel that never knows it's close. Next, kill the dreamer in the nose, the magnetic influence pistol that was tuned to a textbook planet. The Pacific's magnetic field is not a constant. It humps and dips like the sea floor varies by latitude and by the local geology beneath the keel. The Mark VI loved those variations the way a liar loves ambiguity. The cure hard off. Remove the coil's authority. Some crews cut the lead, others pulled the trigger sleeve. All of them logged the change and accepted the trade they would give up the back-breaking keel snap that seldom came and take in exchange detonations they could plan on. The contact pistol, the blunt heart of the fix, demanded craft. In the faulty geometry, high closing speeds and square impacts deformed the firing assembly before the pin could finish its job. The answer was threefold. First, alignment shims and guide bushings kept the pin and its bore coaxial under shock. Second, stiffness springs of better temper and slightly higher rate ensured the sear released decisively, and the pin finished its travel through inertia and intent, not inertia alone. Third, face hardness, peening, and where available case hardening at the striker's bearing surfaces reduced mushrooming when steel met steel at the wartime velocities lab benches never truly reproduced. Crews proved the work with anvil tests, inert heads rammed against a bolted steel plate at controlled speed, or drop tests of the pistol carrier onto a calibrated block. Pass, fail was not theoretical. It sounded like a room saying yes. Then there was guidance and approach, the human interface with the machine. The torpedo data computer could compose elegant solutions. The trick was to compose brutal ones. Skippers shifted from finesse angles that flattered magazine diagrams to meat and bone attack geometries, 70 to 90 degrees, when practicable spreads that walked across a target's path rather than sketching along it. Salvo intervals trimmed to exploit the target's turning circle after the first hit. On the weapon itself, crews learned that at times the lower speed setting did more killing than the glamorous, high, less nose shock, more fuse integrity, a longer run that still met the target because the TDC had been told the truth. Quality control became a sacrament. Torpedo rooms ran checklists like heart-lung machines, gyro checks, motor spin-ups, battery temperature logs, magnetic cutout verified, tagged, and witnessed by 2 ratings. Contact pistol travel measured with feeler gauges that had lived their previous lives in machine shops. Chiefs instituted 3-sign rules on critical steps. No single set of eyes would bless a weapon. When a fish left the rack, it left with the moral weight of a team behind it. None of this was expensive. All of it was precise. The secret sauce was a conversion of epistemology from believing the factory report to believing the cliff, From trusting the spec sheet to trusting the white pillar of water that means you are alive tomorrow. It was not contempt for engineers. It was the highest respect. Engineers include chiefs with salt on their boots and skippers who can read a wake like a ledger, proof accumulated in the logbooks. Premature rates collapsed where magnetics were disabled. Depth error once a rumor shrank to a number crews could name and then to a margin they could exploit. Contact failures at 90-degree strikes fell off as the modified pistols proved they would not flinch. Skippers reported sequences that had been mythical. First hit cripples, second breaks the back, third finishes the escort that thought itself brave. Patrol narratives changed verb tense from subjunctive sorrow to past tense fact. Even the way crews spoke about the weapon shifted. The torpedo was no longer an article of faith, but a colleague whose quirks were understood and accommodated. Set 6.5 3-fish spread 2-second spacing contact. Only a sentence like that meant something exact, now not a prayer written in grease pencil. The TDC's algebra, married to modifications you could hold in your palm, produced the only truth the sea respects: results. Simplicity finally revealed its ferocity. A disabled coil is not elegant, but it cannot lie. A spring of the right rate will never read a memo. A hydrostat proven against rock does not care who signed the test report. War rewards that kind of character. The boats went back to work with weapons that were at last honest, and honesty at sea is indistinguishable from lethality. Place Hawaiian operating area southwest of Kahulawe for proof. Then the Philippine Sea convoy lanes between Formosa and Luzon. Date August-September 1943. Dawn lifts like a curtain over a gray sea. The boat sits awash, hands cold from a night of work that felt more like liturgy than maintenance. Gauge, shim spring witness marks, scored with a scribe. Magnetics positively dead. The skipper studies the range card for the island's black cliffs, yesterday's judge, and looks instead at today's assignment: real steel, not rock. Dispatches have painted an appetizing lane, tankers sliding south from Formosa escort stingy but proud, air cover intermittent. The Admiral's cable is folded like a talisman in the XO's pocket. It says in Navy prose, as blunt as a hammer: proceed, prove, report by effects. Before the boat crosses the line where land is rumor and shipping is a smell, they run a last ritual. A practice head hums out, and in as the crew times the motor checks, gyro settle reads batteries like a cardiogram. The torpedo room chief touches the nose of each warshot, as if christening steel. The magnetic switch tags are double-checked, signed by two men whose names will not make any book. The contact pistols, their faces peened and proud, cycle against a test block that speaks in a short, satisfying thunk. All of it is documented in pencil because pencil resists poetry. They dive, and the world narrows to Bering speeds and the systematic murder of distance. Hydrophones pick out a convoy before the periscope does 2 escorts, 1 freighter, and something heavier by her gate. The plot tightens on greaseboard. The skipper wants square geometry, and the ocean chooses to indulge him. He takes the approach not with the patience of a lecturer, but with the hunger of a mechanic who finally trusts his wrench. He orders depth settings shallow enough to kiss hulls, spread angles to stitch certainty, and low-speed runs, because he has learned that sometimes slower is truer. In the torpedo room, men go quiet, superstitions hush, then nod, as orders translate into twin tubes made ready. The firing solution matures from guess to inevitability. Fire 1. The boat shivers. A white line writes itself across the periscope glass. Every man who has ever counted silently begins to count again. 30 seconds. 35. The target's bow shoulder grows in the lens, and then the sea repudiates 3 months of humiliation in a single upright pillar of water. The freighter's flank caves. Smoke climbs in confusion, then hardens into flame. In the same breath, fire 2. The second fish arrives not beneath the keel. There is no keel miracle today, but exactly where a hammer would land if a man aimed to break a ship. The column is higher, the flame fatter, and the convoy's world goes suddenly narrow and loud. Escorts turn in deliberate anger. Men in the American boat barely register the depth charge threat because they are watching the truth they built do its work. Downscope. Take her deep. The ballast complains. The boat hums as speed translates into safety. Depth charges fall with a confidence born yesterday. Their patterns are good, their explosions honest. The submarine rides each bloom like a man learning to surf in a war zone. Bulbs tick, paint powders. A coffee mug achieves sudden flight and dies. The XO looks at the skipper with a grin he doesn't permit, and the skipper nods once, a private sacrament between men who have met a promise at last. They escape down a slope of cold water and return hours later to find the escort chewing circles around an oil field marked by flotsam crates, a door achew with nobody in it. No claim required. The sea has certified their result. The next day writes the real chapter. The scout plane misses them. Luck is an accomplice born of distance and clouds. Another convoy materializes by sound, first an aggregate heartbeat. The plot this time shows 4 merchants and 3 escorts, one of them keen, perhaps a veteran, who knows that the ocean now houses predators with honest teeth. The skipper chooses arrogance softened by discipline. He pushes inside the screen not to show off, but because inside is where angles go to die for the target. He wants 90 degrees again, and the convoy gives him 84. Acceptable. Set depth 6.5. Salvo 3. 2-second spacing. The chief repeats it, hand already moving. The boat's own heartbeat becomes audible. Men are organs when they do their work well. Fire 1. Fire 2. Fire 3. The wakes fan like handwriting on danger. The escorts commit to their lanes, weapons sliding off tracks with the casual cruelty of professionals. 30 seconds. Another 30. And then the first merchantman arrests in her motion, the way animals do when hit invisibly, a jolt, a shudder, the stern riding differently than the bow. A pillar. A groan that the hydrophones will not forget. The second detonation follows with courtroom punctuality. The third finds the ship aft, where screws used to pretend they ruled time. The target folds not in drama but in a practical collapse, the kind engineers admire. The escorts earn their pay. The boat goes deep. Pings rake the hull with a blind man's cane. Charges build a forest of pressure that tries to grow through steel. In the control room, competence looks like calm. The quartermaster marks time with a stub of pencil. The plainsman adjusts depth as if shaving. The skip keeps tally of explosions, not as terror, but as telemetry, too far, too near, just right for deception. When the pattern thins, he risks a whisper to the periscope, one eye breaking the surface to witness the war he made. The convoy is broken into mathematics angles, ruined speed surrendered, and the wounded merchant trails a scarf of fire. He gifts her one more fish because mercy at sea is rarely charitable and often tactical. It lands, explodes, and writes the period at the end of an argument. Proof is not a single sinking, but a plot rewritten. Over the next days, the boat repeats the method on other ships in other weather, square angles when possible, shallow depth, as policy contact. Only as creed quality checks that turn superstition into process. Prematures, once as common as profanity, are gone. Duds, once a rhythm, become aberrations worth reporting because they are rare. The crew's talk changes. They stop hedging verbs. They stop saying maybe. The skipper's patrol report drafting in his head uses a different grammar, specific, dry, satisfied. On the 4th attack of the patrol, they meet a tanker. Even cautious men permit themselves hunger at the sight of one. The escorts are jumpy. Their pings feel near in the bones. The approach is a knife fight, periscope depth, too often eyes and ears arguing in unity. The skipper takes what the ocean gives, 71 degrees, not ideal. He believes in his pistol. Fire 2. 30 seconds. The tanker's side receives the blow like a temple door hit by a battering ram. The plume is obscene in its height. A fireball rolls over the deck and takes the air with it. Even the escorts seem to forget their doctrine for a breath-long time because human beings watch fire. The Americans use that gift of seconds to slide down and away, men counting not seconds now, but the sequence of charges they know they have earned. After 12 days of work like this, 4 kills, 1 damaged, multiple depth charge educations, the skipper composes the message that matters. Results by effect: freighter sunk, freighter sunk, freighter sunk, tanker sunk. Weapon performance: contact pistol modifications, satisfactory. magnetic influence disabled. Depth control verified by live fire. No prematures observed. No duds observed. Post-action debris consistent with catastrophic structural failure at frame locations corresponding to strike points. It reads like a scientist smiling in a lab, where the beakers finally boil when they should. On the pier, weeks later, the admiral reads the patrol report in a hangar that smells of oil and victory held in check. He circles nothing. He signs his name. He sends the results to people who once spoke in footnotes. He does not say, "I told you so." He says, "Proceed as before the three most beautiful words a crew can earn." The first sign was statistical, which made it easy to ignore. A convoy commander in the Bashi Channel marked his log with a small sour note. 2 ships lost in one attack, both to clean square detonations. He underlined nothing. He could chalk it to luck, to weather, to the weary competence of an enemy who sometimes gets it right. The chart on his bulkhead still showed friendly tonnage flowing north, like blood in a healthy vein. His escort's depth charge expenditures were within plan. Doctrine radiated comfort, harassment not hinge. The second sign was acoustic. Sonarmen on Japanese escorts began to recognize a tempo after the first hit a second fish, arriving on schedule rather than whim. Old hands, the kind who trust their ears more than their officers, smoked quieter cigarettes and said little. Rhythm at sea means intention. Intention means the enemy has a tool he believes in. Then came the night reports, the ones written in the stiff prose of men trying not to sound afraid. First detonation, 4 of the bridge. Second detonation, abaft the engine room. Third detonation, unknown, presumed finish. Officers avoided the word sequence because sequence lives in mathematics, and mathematics feels inevitable. One captain blamed his helmsman for not turning fast enough after the first hit. Another blamed doctrine for teaching turns that were too predictable. A third, honest to his doom, blamed the torpedo for finally doing what torpedoes are supposed to do. On shore, technical bureaus had their own realization, slower and more humiliating. They had built comfort upon reports of American duds, reports that now felt historical rather than current. Intercepts hinted at procedural heresy, enemy crews disabling magnetic influence, modifying contact pistols, conducting live fire tests against cliffs. The idea itself insulted them, barbarous, undisciplined, anti-doctrinal. Yet ships were dying in patterns that matched such heresy. The engineers penned memoranda that tried to say impossible without saying blind. In the wardrooms, laughter grew brittle. "Their torpedoes run deep," an old joke said, and the joke began to land like a lie. A merchant skipper riding home by a light too dim for hope confessed that he did not believe in zigzag anymore. Zigzag works against a hesitant weapon. It does not work against certainty. At sea, the escorts faced the ugliest truth. First, their own bravery had been subsidized by the enemy's incompetence. Without the subsidy, their heroism began to look like exposure. After the first explosion, when doctrine says counterattack, a new voice in the head now said there will be a second. Depth charge patterns were still flung with zeal, but they were flung at a problem that had moved a few minutes into the past, at the place where the submarine had been, while the second torpedo was already running its argument toward the next hull. A captain in the East China Sea, the kind who writes clearly even to condemn himself, recorded the instant his belief broke. First hit amidships, he ordered the textbook turned to comb the tracks. As the helm came over, a second torpedo struck aft with a timing that did not feel like luck. He wrote one word in the margin: method. Once you give the enemy method, you give him tomorrow. He asked for permission to alter convoy procedure, to sweep wider, to vary speeds more violently, to commit escorts to aggressive searches, even if it thinned the close screen. The reply was polite. The reply was slow. The reply was less relevant. Each hour fuel burned and ships sank. On the broad canvas of strategy, the realization appeared not as poetry, but as shortages. Oil deliveries that had been constrained now became accusatory blanks on a ledger. Factories stopped some mornings not because bombs fell, but because valves shrugged in dry pipes. Aircraft sat with strong pilots and empty tanks. The military term was operational pause. The civilian experience was cold. Inside the technical cadres, self-respect wrestled with stubbornness. Some proposed countermeasures premised on the old American failure: shallower torpedo nets, different convoy spacings, faith that underkeel shots remained the primary threat. Others, the heretics on their side, argued that hull-hitting contact attacks were now the main danger, and that doctrine must adjust. They might as well have argued with the weather. The submarines had already adjusted. The ocean had already ruled. By the time memoranda completed their courteous circuits, a dozen new sinkings had joined the argument. Psychology did what physics began. Merchant crews who had once run calmly at general quarters felt a personal malice in the sea. They called the second torpedo the finisher in whispers, as if naming it would summon it faster. Escorted nights grew longer. The glow of cigarettes on decks became rarer. Some captains darkened their ships to the point of superstition, silhouettes vanishing into a black that could not hide their wakes. Wake is truth. Torpedoes read truth. And still the escorts fought. Their pings drilled the dark with the desperate competence of artisans. Charges rolled. Some submarines died. War is never a monologue. But the statistical tilt refused to tilt back. If a boat died after sinking 2 ships, the convoy still arrived the next week, with fewer hulls and more fear. Even victory felt like loss under that arithmetic. An escort commander wrote in his diary that each counterattack now tasted like punishment without prevention. The climax, if you need a single scene, occurred on a hard blue morning east of the Batons. A Japanese captain watched his forward tanker take a square hit and begin to burn with the obscene dignity of a dying refinery. He ordered the screen in. Doctrine said a submarine having fired would flee. Doctrine still thought like a torpedo that failed more often than it worked. He ordered his helmsman to turn to the angle that had saved ships last year. Mid-order, a second column of water broke from his own bow quarter, so close he felt the deck lift in his knees. Not a random blow, not an underkeel dream, a placed strike. He did not finish the old sentence. He gave a new one, evasive at will. It was a small surrender of control and a large admission of reality, each ship on its own, because the pattern that once protected them had become a map the enemy read. Afterward, the reports were softer in tone and harder in content. They advised variance. They recommended humility. They recorded losses not as regrettable but as structural, a word that engineers use when a beam does not fail because someone kicked it, but because the design no longer bears the load placed upon it. The load was a campaign. The design assumed the enemy's torpedoes were untrustworthy. The design was now wrong. Back in Tokyo, a senior officer, competent, loyal, and tired, touched a pin on a wall map that marked a convoy route and said to a colleague, "We are being strangled by 2%. He meant the American submarine force. He did not know the percentage was near the truth. He knew the feeling was exact. His colleague asked whether the Americans had invented a new torpedo. The officer shook his head. "Worse," he said. "They have learned to trust the old one." That is the enemy's realization, not that America conjured wonder tech, but that sailors with grease under their nails made simple things true under pressure. The laughter stopped, because the joke had been subsidized by a malfunction. Without the subsidy, the war's economics revealed themselves. A convoy is only as brave as its least lucky ship. A doctrine is only as modern as last night's explosion. And the ocean, which never signs memos, marked a verdict in fire and pillars of white. The problem had been removed, not by invention, but by honesty. Strategy rarely turns on miracles. It turns on reliability. Once crews made the torpedo, honest magnetics, silenced contact pistols, strengthened depths verified by rock rather than rumor, the Pacific campaign unlocked like a door that had only ever needed the right pressure on the latch. Convoy routes that once looked survivable on wall maps began to resemble arteries exposed to winter air. The change did not shout. It accumulated ship days, lost cargo, not delivered sorties unflew because tanks were dry factories that woke to silence instead of steam. 1,000 small absences add up to a verdict. Operationally, the submarine force shed its timid math. Where skippers once penciled in hedges, extra spreads to buy back the torpedo's unreliability, they now wrote plans with the economy of men who trust their tools. Approaches tightened, angles squared. Shot doctrine simplified to what the sea had endorsed: shallow settings, contact-only brutal geometry. Boats no longer lingered after a first hit to see if it took. They wrote sequences, then left the scene to depth and time. The tempo shifted from opportunism to orchestration. On charts in Pearl and Fremantle, pins moved like metronomes. The enemy felt it first in logistics, then in mind. Tankers, the shimmering center of gravity, went from hard targets to foregone conclusions when conditions were met. Each lost tanker unspooled consequences, measured not just in tons, but in hours of aircraft unfueled convoys, delayed factories, idled. The submarine arm was 2% of the Navy's people, but its leverage climbed until it bent theater-level plans. Carrier raids cut deeper when the sea lanes behind them had been bled. Island garrisons withered not only under bombardment, but under arithmetic. Strategy ceased to be a contest of symmetric plans. It became a race between American method and Japanese metabolism, and metabolism loses when the blood is gone. Culturally, a precedent took root that outlived the war frontline ingenuity as policy, not peccadillo. The admiral who signed the heresies taught a generation of officers that doctrine must answer to outcome. Field modifications, once the province of chiefs with pocket files and guilty consciences, were given the dignity of checklists and cables. The message that traveled from the torpedo rooms to the E-ring and back was not romantic, but institutional: validate in combat, then codify. That rhythm: observe, alter, test, deploy, became a kind of American grammar visible later in hedgerow cutters, on tanks in radar employment, refined by night fighters in proximity fuses, rushed from benches to battlefields. War rewarded the habit. Even the enemy's countermeasures taught the same lesson in reverse. Japanese escorts grew craft and courage. Patterns improved. Searches grew more cunning. Yet each defensive adaptation addressed the submarine as it used to be, not as it had become. By the time a memorandum finished its polite circuit ashore, 3 more sinkings had advanced the conversation at sea. That latency is the tax doctrine pays when it outranks reality. America, by permitting reality to outrank doctrine in a torpedo room, lowered the tax across a campaign. Years later, when historians argue tonnage figures and sink lists, they still circle back to the same fulcrum: reliability converted bravery into leverage. Before the fix, a perfect approach risked a hollow thud. After, the same courage compounded first ship, crippled, second, finished escort, punished for good measure, each success buying the next by starving the enemy's options. The war machine did not suddenly roar. It kept time, and time is the secret engine of victory. Once the weapon told the truth, the campaign stopped stalling and began to roll. The last word belongs to those who had to live with the first ones. In wardrooms after the war, American skippers spoke quietly about months spent stalking with a blade that folded. They did not romanticize the fix. They described it: a coil cut, a spring swapped a pistol, aligned a cliff that answered the kind of genius that smells of oil, not incense. One of them asked what changed the most, said, "Our luck." He let the silence hold just long enough, then added, "Because luck is what you call reliability the first week it shows up." The technical men, gray at the temples, now kept their own counsel. They had learned that the ocean will never sign your test reports, only grade them. A chief torpedo man handed a museum-perfect Mark 14 years after he last loaded one. In anger, tapped the nose and murmured, "You were a liar, and then you weren't." He did not mean superstition. He meant the difference between laboratory and judgment rendered by cliff and convoy. Across the water, admissions hardened into the sort of prose that tries to forgive itself. A logistics officer wrote in a post-war study, "Shipping losses accelerated when enemy torpedoes ceased to be uncertain. Our countermeasures presumed uncertainty." An escort commander who had spent nights sewing depth charges into black water like a man attempting to stitch a wound closed underwater wrote privately, "We were brave on borrowed time." Neither man was praising the enemy's miracle. They were acknowledging the enemy's humility: sailors who stopped arguing with a specification and made a weapon tell the truth. If you prefer your last words blunt, take the admiral who carried the fight on his letterhead and in his bones. Confronted with the polite fog that once surrounded the torpedo's failures, he cut through it with a sentence that became a standard. "Fix the damned torpedoes." It reads like anger. It was stewardship. Underneath it lay the principle that good navies forget at their peril. Doctrine is a hypothesis. Combat is the experiment. Survival is the peer review. And if you want a sentence that sounds like an epitaph written by the ocean itself, choose the one a Japanese captain is said to have uttered as he watched a second column of water lift from the sea where no mercy should have stood. They have learned to trust the old one. He meant the torpedo. He meant the men. He meant the habit of mind that accepts what works and discards what doesn't. No matter who signed the memo, history will chalk the Pacific submarine war to percentages and aggregates. 2% of a navy strangling a maritime empire, curves, bending ledgers, emptying. That arithmetic matters, but the contour of the curve was drawn by hands in cramped rooms, by chiefs with files, by skippers with nerve, by an admiral who took the weight. The impossible idea was not exotic at all. It was courage in a smaller, rarer key, the courage to contradict a manual, to test in the only laboratory that counts, and to keep the change when it works. So the final word is simple and fits on the back of a clipboard: make it honest. At sea, honesty detonates.